3. That is the number of female European bison loaded into transport vehicles in the summer of 2022 and released into a dense commercial pine plantation in Kent, England, a forest that, according to every forestry assessment on record, could not sustain them without active human management. I accepted that framing. I accepted the official narrative that what was happening in West Blean and Thorndon Woods was a careful, monitored intervention, a controlled experiment with known variables and measurable outcomes, the kind of project that generates cautiously optimistic press releases and quarterly ecological reports. I didn't look too closely at what the tracking data actually said. I didn't question why the veterinary logs were so confident. Then I started pulling the institutional record on what those 3 animals did to that forest in the weeks and months after the cameras stopped following them closely. And once I did, I found something the official summary has never fully accounted for. On September 9, 2022, a team of rangers walked into a secluded thicket in West Blean Woods, expecting to log routine tracking data on 3 animals. They found 4. Hold that. Because before we get to what that unrecorded birth reveals about the limits of institutional science, and what it reveals about everything we thought we understood about ecological control, you need to understand what this forest was before those animals arrived, and why the people managing it were so certain they knew exactly what it needed. West Blean and Thorndon Woods did not become a commercial pine plantation by accident. The transition happened across decades of deliberate post-war forestry policy, as the British government systematically converted ancient mixed woodland into dense, revenue-generating conifer stands. By the time the Wilder Blean project began its preliminary assessments, the site had accumulated nearly a century of intensive management literature, timber yield data, canopy density surveys, soil compaction records, all pointing toward the same institutional conclusion, that this forest, left unmanaged, would collapse in on itself. The official conservation record was unambiguous. The 3 females released in July 2022 were not released blindly. Prior to transport, each animal had undergone a comprehensive veterinary protocol, physical examination, blood screening, hormonal analysis, and close-quarters ultrasound assessment. The Kent Wildlife Trust's own documentation describes the pre-release health checks as thorough. The tracking collars fitted to each animal were logging movement data in near real time. Rangers were conducting regular visual surveys of the enclosure perimeter. By every institutional measure, these animals were among the most closely monitored large mammals in Britain. One of them was pregnant, nobody knew. Let me say that again more carefully. The ultrasound found nothing. The hormonal panels indicated nothing. The behavioral monitoring flagged nothing. A female European bison, a species whose gestational period runs approximately 9 months and whose late-term physical changes are, under normal observation conditions, visually apparent, had either suppressed or concealed every detectable marker of a pregnancy that was, by September, close to term. The calf weighed approximately 25 kilograms at birth. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series follows the evidence into the gaps that mainstream conservation narratives prefer to leave unexamined. What the silent gestation suggests about our baseline assumptions is uncomfortable enough. What the animals did to the forest, while nobody was watching their physiology, is something else entirely. Within their first 100 days in West Blean, the 3 females had begun dismantling the canopy in a way that the Wilder Blean project's own forestry schedules had budgeted years and significant mechanical expense to replicate. The behavior is not complicated to describe. Bison rub. They press their massive bodies against tree trunks and grind, using the friction to shed winter coat, to relieve irritation, to mark territory. It is one of the most documented large mammal behaviors in the ecological literature. What the literature had not modeled for a dense commercial pine plantation in Kent was the structural consequence of a 700-kilogram animal applying that pressure repeatedly to non-native conifers whose root systems, planted in compacted post-war soil, were never engineered for lateral stress. The trees came down, not all of them, but the ones on the forestry removal schedule came down first and faster than any projected timeline. The canopy did not collapse. It opened. Light reached the forest floor in irregular, organic patterns that no planned logging operation had managed to produce in decades of trying. Remember that detail, the irregularity. Because what happened in those newly lit patches of disturbed ground is where this investigation takes a turn I was not expecting. The disturbed ground was not incidental. When a bison dust bathes, it does not merely sit. It rolls its full body weight into the earth repeatedly, grinding loose soil into a shallow, open crater, a wallow that strips away surface vegetation, breaks up compacted substrate, and exposes the mineral layer beneath to direct sunlight. The Wilder Blean site ecologists recorded multiple active wallow sites forming across the enclosure within the first season. What they were not expecting was what the exposed soil temperature data subsequently showed. The wallows were warmer, measurably, consistently warmer than the surrounding forest floor. The temperature differential, modest in absolute terms, was apparently sufficient. Sand lizards, a species listed as a conservation priority in the UK, absent from the West Blean site registry for decades, were recorded basking at the wallow edges. Specialist burrowing invertebrates appeared in the disturbed substrate. Pioneer plant species, whose seeds had presumably been present but dormant in the compacted soil, began germinating in the exposed mineral earth. 3 animals, rolling in the dirt, and a cascade of absent species simply resumed. I want to be careful about how I phrase what the evidence suggests here, because the implication is significant. Biodiversity, in this case, was not something planted or introduced or engineered. It was something the soil was already holding, waiting for a very specific kind of disturbance to unlock it. The question that raises about everything we have spent decades doing to these landscapes is one I was not prepared to sit with. The institutions did not celebrate this quietly. What the Wilder Blean Project's early ecological data produced, alongside the species returns and the canopy transformation, was a category of bureaucratic discomfort that the official communications were careful never to name directly. The rangers who had spent years executing scheduled clearance operations, chainsaws, machinery, carefully logged removal quotas, found themselves watching 3 animals accomplish in a single season what the management plan had projected would take the better part of a decade. That is not a comfortable thing to document in a funding report. Prior to the Wilder Blean Project, European regulations formally classified large herbivores like bison under livestock legislation, restricting their movement and management as though they were agricultural assets rather than geological forces. That classification has since required revision. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't encountered elsewhere, consider sharing this investigation. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes for traditional institutions to ignore what the data already shows. Now, back to Kent, because the most unsettling chapter of this story is still unfolding in real time. The calf born in West Blean in September 2022 is still there, growing, moving through a forest that looks measurably different from the one its mother entered just weeks before its birth. The herd is small, the enclosure is bounded, and yet the legal framework governing rewilding permits across the United Kingdom has been formally revised in the years since, not because a committee recommended it, not because a new study was commissioned. Because 3 animals made the old framework factually indefensible. That is the shape of what this investigation found. A pregnancy the technology could not see, a canopy the machinery could not open correctly, a soil that already held everything the management plans were trying to plant, and a bureaucratic classification system that treated a geological force as livestock until the evidence made that classification embarrassing to maintain. I don't have a clean answer to the question this raises. I want to be honest about that. What I have is a pattern, and the pattern suggests that the landscape we have been describing as broken may have been waiting, in the seeds, in the soil temperature, in the dormant wallow depressions, for us to stop managing it long enough to find out. If this investigation has been worth your time, leave your thoughts below. I am genuinely interested in what you're seeing in the data that I may have missed.